The day Ethan Caldwell walked out of Brighton Freight Solutions, nobody stopped him. 9 years of his life, 9 years of late nights, missed dinners, and problems solved before anyone else even noticed them. And not a single person in that building said, "Wait." The man who kept everything running just picked up a cardboard box, walked past the front desk, and pushed through the glass doors into the cold. What happened inside that company in the weeks that followed would shake every person who'd ever taken a loyal employee for granted. If that hits close to home, subscribe and stay until the end, because this one's going to stay with you. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The alarm went off at 5:15, same as always. Ethan Caldwell didn't groan, didn't fumble for the snooze button. He just lay there for a moment in the dark, staring at the ceiling of his apartment on Mercer Street, listening to the radiator knock and hiss the way it always did in November. Then he sat up, put his feet on the cold floor, and started the day. That was Ethan. Methodical, steady. The kind of man who kept things moving not because anyone asked, but because it didn't occur to him to do it any other way. He'd been at Brighton Freight Solutions for 9 years. Started as a logistics coordinator straight out of college, working under a regional manager named Howard Briggs, who smelled like coffee and old paper and had a habit of tapping his pen on the desk when he was thinking. Howard had hired Ethan on the spot after a 20-minute interview, not because his resume was impressive, it wasn't, but because Ethan had spent 15 minutes asking Howard questions about the company's routing inefficiencies before Howard could ask him a single question of his own. "You're not here to get a job," Howard had said, leaning back in his chair with something like amusement. "You're here to fix something." Ethan hadn't known how to answer that. He just said, "I think I could help." Howard hired him the next morning. That was 9 years ago. Howard had retired 4 years back, moved to a place in Florida with his wife and 3 dogs. Ethan had driven to the retirement party, stood in the corner eating bad canapes, and shaken Howard's hand on the way out. Howard had held on a beat too long. "Don't let them burn you out," Howard had said. Not as advice, more like a warning. Ethan had smiled and told him he'd be fine. I wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. Brighton Freight Solutions occupied 4 floors of a glass and concrete building on the eastern edge of the city's industrial corridor. Not the glamorous part of downtown, not quite the warehouse district either, but somewhere in between. The kind of address that said functional rather than impressive. 43 employees on a good day. Trucking contracts, logistics management, regional distribution partnerships. Nothing flashy. The company made money because it moved things reliably, on time, without drama. That had been the pitch for 30 years. Ethan's job title, Senior Operations Coordinator, didn't really capture what he actually did. His official duties were scheduling, routing adjustments, and client communication. His actual duties were closer to fix whatever's broken, figure out why it broke, stop it from breaking again, and do it before anyone important notices it was broken in the first place. He was good at it, not in a way that generated much praise, because the nature of the work meant that success looked like nothing happening. A shipment reaching its destination on time looked identical to a shipment that would have been 4 hours late if Ethan hadn't rerouted it through Springfield at 2 in the morning. Nobody throws a party for a problem that never became a problem. He understood that. He'd made his peace with it. His office, if you could call it that, was a corner desk on the 3rd floor, wedged between a filing cabinet and a window that looked out over the parking lot. He had a photograph of his sister Nora and her 2 kids tacked to the wall beside his monitor. A coffee mug with a chipped handle that he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. A whiteboard covered in routing maps, color-coded by carrier and delivery window, that his coworker Diane had once described as what a headache looks like. "It makes sense to me," Ethan had told her. "That's what I said," Diane replied. A headache. He liked Diane. She worked accounts receivable on the other side of the floor, had 3 cats she talked about like colleagues, and brought in banana bread on the first Friday of every month without fail. She'd been at Brighton 11 years and knew where everybody was buried, administratively speaking. They weren't close exactly, but in the way of people who spend more waking hours together than with their own families, they understood each other without having to explain much. The first Monday in October, Marcus Whitmore arrived. Ethan heard about it before he saw it. There was a company-wide email at 8:45 that morning with the subject line, "Welcome to our new CEO," and a headshot of a man in his mid-40s, who had the kind of square jaw and confident posture that belonged on the cover of a business magazine. The email used words like transformative and operational excellence and competitive positioning. Diane appeared at Ethan's desk within 4 minutes of the email going out. She stood there reading it on her phone with her arms crossed. Transformative, she said flatly. Could mean a lot of things, Ethan said. Yeah. She looked up. It never means anything good. She wasn't wrong about that, as it turned out. Marcus Whitmore came from a logistics consulting background. That was the word that went around. And he'd spent 15 years advising companies on how to do more with less, which, in practice, Ethan had come to understand, usually meant doing the same with less, and calling it efficiency. Marcus walked the floors in the first week like he was appraising a property, hands behind his back, asking questions that sounded like questions, but were actually statements about how things should be different. He stopped at Ethan's desk on a Thursday afternoon. You're Caldwell. Yes, Ethan said. Howard Briggs hired you. He did. Marcus looked at the whiteboard, at the filing cabinet, at the photograph of Nora's kids. Your scheduling system, Marcus said. It's analog. Parts of it, Ethan said. The digital system has gaps. I work around them. The gaps need to be fixed. The workarounds are redundant. Ethan looked at him. The gaps have been there for 6 years. I've submitted 4 written proposals to address them. Each one was tabled. There was a brief silence. Marcus studied him with an expression that wasn't quite hostile, more like the way you might look at a piece of furniture you weren't sure where to put. We'll talk more, Marcus said, and moved on. They did not talk more. Not that week, and not the next. What Marcus did instead was schedule meetings. A lot of them. With department heads, with external consultants, with a firm called Apex Strategy Group, whose representatives showed up in tailored jackets and gave presentations full of pie charts and phrases like streamlining operational throughput. The employees on the 3rd floor watched these meetings happen behind the glass-walled conference room and tried to read lips. They keep pointing at this chart with all the red, Diane murmured one afternoon, peering over the top of her monitor. Red means costs, Ethan said without looking up. They keep pointing at the biggest red section. That's personnel. Diane sat back in her chair. Great. The first change came in week 3. Overtime pay would now require pre-approval from a direct supervisor with a 24-hour notice window. The 3rd floor went quiet when that memo circulated. Overtime had never been monitored that closely before, not because Brighton was generous, but because half the work that kept the company running happened in the margins, in the early mornings and the late evenings when someone noticed a problem and stayed to fix it. The new policy didn't account for that. It didn't account for the fact that freight didn't observe business hours. Ethan sent a brief memo to Marcus outlining the operational impact. Professional, factual, 3 paragraphs. He got back a response the same afternoon. Thank you for your input. The policy is effective immediately. He put the response in a folder. He started keeping that folder. By November, the atmosphere on the floor had shifted in a way that was hard to name precisely, but impossible to miss. People were quieter. Lunches got shorter. There was more checking of phones, more careful watching of the clock. A man named Terrence from the dispatch team had been let go in mid-October, budget reallocation, the official reason, and his desk sat empty for 2 weeks before anyone cleared it, which bothered Ethan more than he could reasonably explain. Terrence had been there 7 years. He'd brought his daughter in once for Take Your Child to Work Day and spent most of the morning showing her how the routing software worked. She'd asked so many questions that Ethan had given up his lunch break to keep answering them. Terrence had sent him a thank you email afterward that Ethan still had, somewhere. Nobody had a going-away party for Terrence. There wasn't time. It was a Tuesday, and by Wednesday the workload from his position had quietly redistributed itself across the remaining team without any formal announcement. That was how it worked now. Ethan absorbed his share and kept going. He didn't complain about it, partly because complaining wasn't his instinct, and partly because he understood, in a practical sense, that saying something would not change anything. What he did instead was document. He started keeping careful records of every routing decision, every workaround, every problem caught before it escalated. Not for any particular purpose, just because it seemed like the right thing to do. Because in his experience, the people who could show their work were the ones who survived. He started working later, not because Marcus's policy required it. He was careful now about formal overtime, but because the volume of work simply didn't fit inside regular hours anymore. He'd sit at his desk after most of the floor had emptied and work through carrier confirmations and delivery exceptions and client queries in the quiet. Diane sometimes walked past on her way out and paused at his desk. "Go home, Ethan. I'll be done in 20 minutes. You said that last Tuesday." "This Tuesday, I mean it." She'd shake her head and leave, and he'd sit there another hour and a half and feel, dimly, the way you feel when you're doing something you know you shouldn't but can't quite stop. His apartment was quiet. That was the thing. There was nobody waiting for him there. He'd had a relationship end 2 years ago. A woman named Cassandra, who was an urban planner, and who had told him, with a precision that still impressed him, that he was emotionally present but physically absent, and that she couldn't build something with a person who was always somewhere else in his head. She hadn't been wrong. He'd known she wasn't wrong even while she was saying it. So the apartment was quiet, and the office was at least occupied, and it was easier to stay than to go home to the silence and think about all the things that were slowly accumulating. The first week of December arrived with a cold snap and a nor'easter that hit the Mid-Atlantic distribution corridor hard. 2 carrier partners had weather delays. A warehouse facility in Harrisburg lost power for 6 hours. 3 major clients had time-sensitive shipments sitting in limbo, and the phones were ringing constantly. Ethan worked 42 hours in 3 days. He rerouted 11 shipments manually, managed to get a carrier dispatch redirected through 2 alternate hubs, and personally called every affected client to walk them through the updated delivery windows. He didn't sleep much. He ran on bad vending machine coffee and sheer operational stubbornness. On the 3rd day, he made an error. A small one, a transposed shipment ID on a reroute form that caused a 4-hour hold before he caught it himself and corrected it. No client impact. Nothing that mattered in any real sense. Marcus summoned him to his office on a Friday morning. The office was on the 4th floor, corner room, big windows, the kind of clean desk that indicated either excellent organization or very little actual work. Marcus was on the phone when Ethan arrived and held up a finger without looking over. Ethan stood and waited. When Marcus hung up, he turned around and picked up a printed form from the desk. The reroute correction. "This is yours," Marcus said. "Yes. I caught it within the hour and corrected it before any client impact." "The error shouldn't have occurred." "I agree," Ethan said. "I'd been awake for approximately 30 hours at that point, managing the storm routing. I've submitted a summary of the shipments recovered and the client communications if you'd like to review. I'm aware of the storm," Marcus said. "I'm talking about quality control." Ethan looked at him steadily. "I am too. I'm saying that one minor error, self-corrected with no external impact, over the course of a 3-day emergency response where I covered approximately 2.5 positions worth of work, isn't a quality control failure. It's a workload issue." Marcus set the paper down. "We expect our senior coordinators to maintain standards regardless of conditions," he said. "That's what the title means." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. Outside the window behind Marcus's desk, the city looked gray and cold and ordinary. "I understand," Ethan finally said. "Good. That'll be all." He walked back to his desk, sat down, and stared at his whiteboard for a long time. The color-coded routes. The carrier windows. 9 years of accumulated knowledge about how to keep the whole thing moving, annotated in dry erase marker across a board that Marcus had looked at and called redundant. He picked up his phone and called his sister Nora. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear her kids in the background, the familiar chaos of a house that had people in it. "Hey," she said. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," he said. Then, "Not really." She waited. That was one of the things about Nora, she didn't fill silences prematurely. "I think I've been confusing loyalty with something else," he said. "Like what?" He thought about it. "Like a personality trait. Like it's just part of who I am instead of something I choose." There was a pause on her end. One of the kids said something loudly about a missing shoe. "Ethan," Nora said carefully, "what happened?" "Nothing specific," he said. "But everything specific. I don't know." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the photograph tacked to the wall. Nora's 2 kids on a beach somewhere, squinting into the sun, mid-laugh. I've been here 9 years and I just got dressed down for making one mistake during a 72-hour crisis because standards don't care about context. That's not okay, Nora said. No, he agreed. It's not. He didn't quit that day. He went home, made dinner, went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in weeks, and got up the next morning and went back. Because that was what he did. Because leaving felt like failure and staying felt like habit, and he wasn't sure yet which one he could live with. But something had shifted. Something quiet and structural. The way a foundation doesn't crack all at once but settles, over time, until one day you notice the door doesn't close the way it used to. He noticed it now. The thing about breaking points is that they rarely announce themselves. You don't wake up one morning and think, today is the day. It doesn't work like that. What actually happens is smaller and quieter. It's a Tuesday or a Thursday, and something ordinary occurs, and you realize you've run out of the thing that used to make ordinary bearable. For Ethan, it started with a phone call he wasn't expecting. It was the second week of December, 8 days after the nor'easter had torn through the mid-Atlantic corridor and left him running on coffee and rerouted carrier contracts. He was at his desk at 7:40 in the morning, earlier than almost anyone else on the floor, working through a backlog of delivery confirmations, when his phone buzzed with a number he recognized immediately. His sister Nora's home line. Not her cell. Her home line, which she only used for things that felt serious. He picked up. Ethan. Her voice was controlled in the way that meant she was working to keep it that way. It's Mom. His mother, Patricia Caldwell, was 67 years old and had lived alone in the house in Roanoke since their father passed 5 years back. She'd had a minor cardiac event 18 months ago, what the cardiologist had carefully called a warning, and had been on medication and monitoring ever since. She was stubborn about her independence in the way that people who've spent decades taking care of others become stubborn when the taking care reverses direction. What happened? Ethan said. She fell. Last night. She's okay. She's at Roanoke Memorial. She's stable. But she broke her wrist and they're keeping her for observation because of the heart history. How bad is the wrist? Bad enough. She needs surgery. Minor surgery. But still, Nora exhaled. I can't get there until Saturday, Ethan. I've got Daniel's school thing on Thursday, and the kids have... I'll go, he said. You sure? She's my mother. He said it simply, without drama, because it was simply true. He hung up and sat for a moment looking at the whiteboard, at the color-coded routing maps and carrier windows, and then he picked up his phone again and pulled up Marcus Whitmore's calendar. Marcus had a slot at 9. Ethan booked it. What? He'd rehearsed what he was going to say, which, in retrospect, was his first mistake. He'd framed it practically. Coverage plan, documented handoff notes, 2 days maximum. He could manage client communications remotely if necessary. He had a folder on his desk with everything organized. He'd even drafted a brief summary of all active shipments and their status, so whoever covered could step in without losing ground. He brought the folder. Marcus was at his desk when Ethan knocked on the open door. He was reading something on his laptop and didn't look up immediately, which was a habit Ethan had noticed. The practiced indifference of someone who wanted people to feel that their arrival was an interruption. Caldwell, Marcus said, still not looking up. I need to request 2 days of personal leave, Thursday and Friday. Ethan came in and placed the folder on the edge of the desk. My mother had a fall last night. She's in the hospital in Roanoke. Broken wrist, surgery scheduled. She lives alone. I've prepared handoff documentation for all active accounts. Coverage can be managed between Diane and... We're in the middle of the quarter close, Marcus said. He closed the laptop. His expression was not unkind exactly, but it had the particular blankness of someone who has already decided what they're going to say. December is our highest volume month. I know. That's why I prepared the handoff documentation. 2 days in December is not the same as 2 days in March. Ethan looked at him. My mother is having surgery. I understand that. A pause. Is it life-threatening? The question landed with a flatness that Ethan felt somewhere specific behind his sternum. She has a cardiac history, he said carefully. Any procedure carries risk. But the fall itself, the surgery, it's a wrist fracture. Yes. Marcus nodded slowly, in the manner of someone who believes they're being reasonable. Here's my concern, Ethan. We just came through a significant weather disruption. You're our senior coordinator. The timing is difficult. The timing of my mother's fall was also difficult, Ethan said. His voice was even. He was proud of that later. Of course. I'm not suggesting she planned it. Marcus leaned back in his chair. What I'm suggesting is that right now, with the quarter where it is, we need our senior people present and focused. We have HR procedures for family emergencies. There may be options there. But I can't simply approve 2 days of discretionary leave in December without understanding the operational impact more fully. The office was very quiet. Outside, through the big windows, the city went about its morning in the gray December light. I have 9 years of accrued leave, Ethan said. I've taken 11 personal days in 9 years. This isn't about your leave balance. Then what's it about? Marcus looked at him with that flat, measuring expression. It's about timing and priorities, that's all. Ethan picked up the folder from the edge of the desk. He held it for a moment. Inside it were 23 pages of handoff notes, carrier contacts, active shipment statuses, client communication logs, escalation protocols. He'd put it together before 7 that morning. He'd been awake since 5:15 the way he always was, and the first thing he'd done after Nora's call was sit down and make sure everyone else would be taken care of. He set the folder back down on Marcus's desk. I'd like you to keep that, he said, in case it's useful. Marcus glanced at the folder. I haven't made a decision. I know, Ethan said. I have. He left before Marcus could respond. He walked back to the elevator, rode it down to the 3rd floor, and sat at his desk for approximately 4 minutes. Not because he was hesitating, more because certain things, once decided, deserve a moment of being still. His desk had lived in this corner for 9 years. The whiteboard had followed him through 3 desk reassignments. The coffee mug with the chipped handle had been a gift from Terrence, actually. A gag gift from a Secret Santa 3 or 4 years back. Chosen because Ethan had once mentioned offhandedly that he always meant to buy a new mug but never got around to it. He'd liked it too much after that to replace it. He looked at the photograph of Nora's kids on the beach. Then he opened his bottom desk drawer and found a box. A copy paper box that someone had left in the supply room, and he began methodically and without rushing to collect his things. The mug, the photograph, a small hardcover dictionary he kept on the desk that had been his father's, a habit from before smartphones when he'd actually used it, a spare phone charger, a notepad with a year's worth of personal routing notes that were no use to anyone but him, a pen his father had given him when he graduated college, a simple ballpoint with his initials engraved, which he'd kept in the pencil cup for 9 years and used almost never because he was afraid of losing it. He put them all in the box. He did not clean out his computer. He did not delete files. He left everything organized and accessible because that was how he was. And because the fact that Marcus Whitmore had just refused him 2 days to be with his injured mother did not mean Ethan Caldwell was going to leave a mess for the people who depended on the work. He logged his active shipments and status in the shared system. He sent a brief email to Diane, marked urgent, outlining everything she would need to know to cover the next 48 hours. He forwarded 2 outstanding client inquiries to the regional manager with a note explaining the situation. He was thorough and specific, and it took him about 25 minutes, and the whole time his hands were steady and his mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in months. When he finished, he put on his coat. Diane came around the corner from the other side of the floor as he was picking up the box. She looked at it. She looked at his face. She was sharp enough not to ask an obvious question. Your mom? She said. She's okay. She needs surgery on her wrist. You're going. Yes. She glanced toward the elevator, toward the 4th floor above them, and back at him. Did he? He cited timing and priorities, Ethan said. Diane's expression went through several things quickly, landing on something that wasn't quite anger, but was adjacent to it. Ethan, it's fine, he said. I mean that. It's fine. He looked around the floor, the rows of desks, the hum of the overhead lights, the empty space where Terrence used to sit. I've been here 9 years. I need to go see my mother. She looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes got a little bright, which surprised him because Diane wasn't generally a person whose eyes got bright. The banana bread, she said. First Friday. I'll still bring it. He didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded. She reached out and squeezed his arm once, briefly, and then stepped back and let him go. He walked through the floor without stopping, past the row of windows. past the conference room where Marcus had stood 6 weeks ago pointing at the red sections of a pie chart, past the front desk where a woman named Priya was on the phone and glanced up as he passed and did a small double-take at the box under his arm, past the bulletin board with the December fire safety training sign-up sheet, 3 names on the list, and the paper was already curling at the edges because someone had taped it with only one piece, and that had never been fixed. He pushed through the glass doors. The elevator opened on the ground floor and he walked through the lobby and out through the main entrance into the December air, which hit him like cold water, immediate and clarifying. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the box under his arm and his breath making small clouds in front of his face. He didn't feel triumphant. He'd heard people describe moments like this in triumphant terms. Finally, freedom, walking away from what was holding you back. He didn't feel any of that. What he felt was something closer to a very specific kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes not from doing too much, but from spending too long pretending that something was sustainable when you already knew it wasn't. He walked to his car. He put the box in the back seat. He sat in the driver's seat and pulled out his phone and called his mother's room at Roanoke Memorial. She picked up on the 4th ring. Her voice was groggy but present. "Patricia Caldwell," she said, which was how she always answered the phone, as if she were still working, as if the world still needed to know who it was talking to. "Mom," he said, "it's me. I'm coming." A pause. "You don't have to do that." "I know. It's December. You're busy." "I'm not actually," he said. "Not anymore." He could hear her breathing, the monitor beeping faintly in the background. "Ethan," she said, "what did you do?" "I left," he said. Another pause. "Was it time?" she asked. He thought about the meeting with Marcus, the folder of handoff notes, the folder he'd been keeping for weeks, documenting every reasonable request that had been ignored. Terrence's empty desk. 42 hours and 3 days and a reprimand for a transposed digit. Howard Briggs telling him at a retirement party, "Don't let them burn you out," as if he already knew how the story ended. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I think it was time about 6 months ago." His mother was quiet for a moment. He could picture her in the hospital bed, her silver hair pulled back, the stubborn set of her jaw, the expression she'd had his whole life that managed to communicate simultaneously, "I told you so, and I'm proud of you. Drive carefully," she said. "The 77 gets icy past Blacksburg." "I know, Mom. And stop somewhere and eat something real, not drive-through." "I'll try." "Ethan." Her voice shifted, just slightly. "I'm glad you're coming." "I know," he said. "Me too." He drove for 5 hours. The highway unspooled under him in the gray December afternoon, the landscape transitioning from the dense sprawl of the metro area to the wider, emptier geography of Western Virginia. The Blue Ridge to the west, the bare trees lining the interstate like rows of antennae, the occasional hawk sitting on a fence post with the complete stillness of a thing that has no interest in your problems. He had a lot of time to think. He thought about Marcus, and the meeting, and the question, is it life-threatening? And the quiet brutality of that framing, the way it treated human circumstance as a variable to be assessed for operational risk, rather than just a thing that was happening to a person. He wasn't furious about it. He'd moved past furious somewhere around the 2nd hour. What he felt now was something cleaner, a kind of settled clarity about the fact that he'd worked for 9 years in a place that had recently, not always, but recently, and increasingly, stopped seeing him as a person. He thought about the handoff notes, the folder with 23 pages of documentation he'd put together in the dark hours of the morning, before 7, after his sister's call, because his instinct had been to take care of the work before he took care of himself. He sat with that for a while on the highway between Staunton and Lexington, the heater running, the radio low, and he felt something uncomfortable about it. Not guilt, but a kind of recognition that the habit of placing the company's needs above his own had been going on so long he'd stopped noticing it was a choice. It had always been a choice. He'd just kept making it automatically, the way you keep turning the same way home even after the road's been closed, out of pure habit, until one day someone puts up a barrier and you have to find a different route. He thought about his mother, in the hospital bed in Roanoke, who had spent 35 years raising 2 kids largely on her own after his father's work took him away more than it kept him home, and who had never once asked either of her children to prioritize her over their own lives, which was its own kind of thing to sit with. He thought about Cassandra, the urban planner, who had told him he was emotionally present but physically absent, and who had been right about that in a way that applied not just to their relationship, but to the broader shape of his life. Always somewhere in the margins of a job, always just one more problem away from being fully where he was. He stopped at a diner outside of Roanoke, like his mother had told him to. He ordered a patty melt and coffee and sat at the counter and looked out the window at the parking lot, at the other people eating dinner on a Wednesday in December, and there was something unexpectedly peaceful about that, about being a person in a diner on an ordinary night, going to see his mother, having nowhere else to be. The waitress refilled his coffee without asking. "Traveling?" she said. "Visiting family," he said. She nodded like that was a perfectly normal answer, because it was, and moved on. He sat there and ate his dinner and didn't check his work email once, and when he paid and walked out to the parking lot, the cold air smelled like wood smoke from somewhere nearby, and the sky above Roanoke had that particular deep blue it gets just after sunset before it goes fully dark. And Ethan Caldwell stood in the parking lot of a diner outside Roanoke, Virginia, and breathed. His mother was smaller than he remembered. She always was, when he went a long time between visits. In his memory, she was larger, taller, more formidable, the woman who had managed a household and 2 children and a career in educational administration with a kind of quiet organizational competence that he had only realized, much later, was exactly where he'd gotten his own. She was sitting up in the hospital bed with her right wrist bandaged and immobilized, and she looked tired and a little pale, but fundamentally like herself. Watchful, composed, slightly annoyed at the inconvenience of the whole situation. "You look thin," she said when he walked in. "Hi, Mom." "I'm not wrong." He set his jacket on the chair and leaned down to hug her carefully, avoiding the wrist. She held on a beat longer than usual. He didn't comment on it. He sat in the chair beside her bed and she told him about the fall. The bathroom rug that had slid on the tile, the crash, the neighbor who had heard it through the wall and called 911 with the kind of fast-acting neighborliness that Ethan filed away as something to be grateful for. The wrist had broken cleanly, the surgeon said, which was considered good news in the language of wrist fractures. Surgery in the morning, home by the weekend if everything went as expected. "I don't want you hovering," she said. "You can take me home on Saturday and make sure the place isn't a disaster, and then you can go deal with your own situation." "My situation is fine," he said. She looked at him with the expression she'd been deploying since he was 8 years old, the one that communicated clearly that she was choosing not to argue about something she considered settled. "Ethan," she said, "Mom, what are you going to do?" He leaned back in the chair. The monitor beeped steadily. Down the hall, someone was talking in a measured, professional tone. A doctor, probably, explaining something to someone. "I don't know yet," he said. "I've got some savings. I've been careful about that." He paused. "I have some ideas." "Ideas," she said, neutral. "There are other companies. Better ones, maybe. I've had a few conversations over the years, people who've reached out." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I turned them down because I was committed to Brighton. And now you're not." "Now I'm not." He looked at her. "Was I wrong to stay as long as I did?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think you stayed as long as it made sense," she said. "And then things changed, and it didn't make sense anymore, and you stayed anyway out of habit, and because leaving felt like giving up." She adjusted her arm carefully. "That's not a character flaw. That's just how people work. The trick is noticing when the habit has stopped serving you." He nodded. Outside the window, the night had settled fully over Roanoke, the lights of the city visible in the distance, steady and indifferent. "I noticed," he said. "I know you did," she said. "That's why you're here." He stayed through this weekend. He slept on the fold-out couch at his mother's house after the hospital discharged her Saturday morning, and he restocked her kitchen and fixed a loose hinge on the back door she'd been meaning to deal with since September, and he sat with her in the evenings while she watched the news and complained about it, and it was ordinary in a way that felt like something he hadn't been able to afford in a while. On Saturday evening, he checked his phone and found 12 emails from Brighton Freight Solutions. 3 were client inquiries that had been forwarded to him incorrectly. 4 were system notifications. 1 was from the regional manager, Trevor Gaines, asking if Ethan was available to walk him through the Harrisburg carrier situation. 1 was from Diane. Not about work, just 2 lines. Hope your mom is okay. The banana bread was good. You were missed. There was nothing from Marcus Whitmore. He set his phone face down on the coffee table. There was one email he'd noticed but hadn't opened yet, from an address he didn't immediately recognize, a Glen Ridge Logistics domain. He opened it Sunday morning while his mother was still asleep. It was from a man named Daniel Cho, operations director at Glen Ridge Logistics, who wrote with a directness Ethan appreciated. He'd heard through mutual industry contacts that Ethan might be in transition, and while he understood the timing might not be right, he wanted to reach out and say that if Ethan was open to a conversation, Glen Ridge would be interested in having one. Ethan read the email twice. Then he went to the kitchen and made coffee. Real coffee, from his mother's ancient percolator that she refused to replace, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard where the oak tree had dropped most of its leaves and the bird feeder needed refilling. And he thought about the word transition and how strange it was that the most accurate word for where he was also somehow the most hopeful one. He typed a reply. Short, professional, measured. Thank you for reaching out. I'd be glad to have a conversation. I'm available starting next week. He sent it before he second-guessed himself. His mother came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, her wrist in its splint, her hair not yet done, the comfortable dishevelment of a woman in her own home. She looked at him, and looked at the coffee and poured herself a cup without saying anything. You're thinking about something, she said. I got an email, he said. Another company. Someone reached out. And? And I said I'd talk to them. She nodded, wrapped both hands around the mug, careful with the splint. The morning light came through the kitchen window at a low December angle and caught the steam rising from the coffee. Good, she said. He drove back to the city on Sunday afternoon. The highway was quiet the way Sundays always are, a different quality of traffic, people returning from things rather than going to them. He had the radio on low and the heater running and the box with his things from the office still in the back seat, the mug, the photograph, the dictionary, the pen with his initials. He didn't know yet what the conversation with Glen Ridge would bring. He didn't know if it would be the right thing or if leaving Brighton had been, or whether any of the decisions he'd made in the last 72 hours would look the same to him in 6 months. That was the thing about breaking points. They clarified the present moment with extraordinary precision, but they didn't say anything about what came next. They just said, not this. He merged onto the interstate. Ahead of him, the city's skyline was visible in the late afternoon haze, gray and real and full of the usual complications. He turned the radio up slightly and kept driving. The Monday after Ethan left, nobody at Brighton Freight Solutions said the word resigned. That was the first strange thing. Marcus Whitmore's office sent a brief email to the third floor Friday afternoon after Ethan was already on the highway to Roanoke, stating that Ethan Caldwell was taking personal leave and that coverage responsibilities would be redistributed temporarily. It used the word temporarily twice. It did not mention that Ethan had walked out carrying a box. It did not mention the meeting that had preceded that. Priya at the front desk had seen the whole thing and had told exactly one person, which in an office of 43 people meant she had told everyone, but the official communication said temporary, and so that was the word people used, carefully, the way you use a word when you're not sure what's true, but you don't want to be the one caught saying the wrong thing. Diane used no such word. Diane, who had watched Ethan walk out with a box under his arm, and then gone back to her desk and read his email. Thorough, specific, covering everything she would need for the next 48 hours and then some, sat with the knowledge of what had actually happened and kept it to herself. Not because she was protecting Marcus Whitmore, but because she was protecting Ethan. Whatever he decided to do next was his to decide. She wasn't going to complicate it by turning it into office gossip before he'd had a chance to land somewhere. She covered what she could. She was accounts receivable, not operations, but she'd been there 11 years and she understood the general architecture of how things moved. She flagged the emails Ethan had forwarded. She called the regional manager, Trevor Gaines, at 8:30 Monday morning and walked him through the active shipment summary Ethan had left in the shared drive. Trevor went quiet when she finished. "This is all from him?" he said. "He put this together before he left?" "Before 7 in the morning," Diane said. "After his mother's fall." Another pause. "Where's Marcus on this?" Trevor said. "Marcus," Diane said, with the careful neutrality of someone choosing each word like a step across ice, "is aware of the situation." Trevor didn't ask anything else. He said he'd handle the Harrisburg carrier follow-up himself. He thanked her. He hung up. Diane went back to her desk and looked at the empty corner across the floor where Ethan's whiteboard was still covered in color-coded routing maps, dry erase marker on white, 9 years of accumulated knowledge in blue and red and green. Nobody had touched it. It stood there like a document of something, though she couldn't have said precisely what. The problem started Wednesday. Not dramatically. That was the thing. There was no single catastrophic failure, no moment where everything collapsed at once, and the cause was obvious. It was smaller than that and worse, in a way, because small failures are easier to explain away, easier to attribute to coincidence or individual error, right up until there are enough of them that the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The first problem was a carrier confirmation for a shipment going to a distribution hub in Columbus. The confirmation had been sitting in a shared inbox, flagged as routine, but it had a footnote, a rate adjustment clause that kicked in if the shipment exceeded a certain weight threshold. Ethan would have caught it. He caught things like that automatically, the way experienced drivers register hazards before they consciously register them. The person covering that inbox, a coordinator named Phil, who'd been with the company 3 years and was competent in his own lane but had never worked the senior routing desk, didn't catch it. The shipment went out under the original rate. Brighton absorbed a $2,300 difference that showed up 2 weeks later in the carrier invoice and required 3 days of back and forth to partially resolve. The second problem was a client named Hargrove Industrial Supply, one of Brighton's longer-standing regional accounts. Hargrove had a specific protocol for delivery windows, a standing note in their account file that Ethan had written himself, updated twice, and referenced in his handoff documentation. The note explained that Hargrove's receiving dock operated on a strict Tuesday-Thursday schedule, and that any deviation required 48 hours notice to their operations manager, a particular woman named Sandra, who did not respond well to surprises. The note was in the file. Someone had just not read all the way to the bottom of it. A Friday delivery got scheduled. Sandra called Brighton at 3 in the afternoon to inform them, with a precision that left no room for interpretation, exactly how she felt about that. The call was routed to Trevor Gaines because nobody else knew what to say. Trevor handled it. He'd been handling things for 30 years and he was good at it. He smoothed it over with Hargrove, barely, and at the cost of a rate concession that Marcus would later describe in a budget meeting as an anomaly. And then he sat at his desk and pulled up Ethan's handoff notes from the shared drive and read them top to bottom. He read them again. Then he walked upstairs to Marcus Whitmore's office. Trevor Gaines was 54 years old. He had the particular physical quality of a man who had once been lean and athletic and had since become something denser, broader, heavier, the kind of build that came from 25 years of desk work and business travel, and meals eaten at irregular hours in regional airports. He'd been regional manager at Brighton for 11 years, and had been through 2 ownership transitions and 1 near bankruptcy, and a period where the company had briefly tried to pivot into pharmaceutical freight, which had not worked. He had survived all of it because he understood what was actually worth worrying about, which was a skill rarer than it looked. He sat down in Marcus's office without being invited to sit. "We have a Hargrove situation," he said. "I'm aware," Marcus said. "I handled it, but I want to talk about the broader issue." Marcus leaned back. "The coordinator coverage." "The coordinator coverage," Trevor said. He set Ethan's handoff document on the desk. "You see this?" Marcus looked at it without picking it up. "Caldwell sent it." "Before he left," Trevor said. "Before 7 in the morning, after his mother had been in the hospital for less than 12 hours. He tapped the stack of papers. 23 pages. Active shipments. Carrier contacts. Account-specific protocols. Escalation procedures. The Hargrove doc note is on page 14. The carrier rate clause issue is the kind of thing that's in his head, which is the problem. It's in his head, not on page 14 or any other page, because nobody told him to write it down because we all just assumed he'd be there. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What's your point, Trevor?" "My point is that Caldwell is not on temporary leave. My point is that he walked out of here because you told him his mother's surgery wasn't sufficient reason to miss 2 days of December. And now we have a Hargrove concession and a Columbus carrier invoice and 2 more clients whose accounts I'm actively worried about because the institutional knowledge required to manage them is not in any system we have. It's in the head of a man who is currently not employed here." Marcus's expression didn't change much, but something behind it shifted slightly, the way pressure shifts in a room when a window is opened. He can be re-engaged, Marcus said. He can be apologized to, Trevor said, which is a different thing and the first step. I don't think... With respect, Trevor said, and paused, because the phrase was doing real work there. I've been here 11 years. I've watched a lot of people come and go. The ones we've regretted losing, we've always known we'd regret it before they were out the door. The difference is whether we did anything about it. He picked up the handoff document and stood. Caldwell documented everything he could. The things he couldn't document are the things we're going to keep running into for the next 6 months. I'd like permission to reach out to him. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Give it 2 weeks, he said finally. Trevor Gaines looked back at him with an expression that said, plainly, that 2 weeks was going to cost them something, but that he understood the political geometry of the situation and was willing to operate within it. 2 weeks, he said. All right, so the 2 weeks cost them a mid-sized client. Clearwater Distribution had been with Brighton for 6 years. They weren't Brighton's largest account, but they were reliable, consistent volume, prompt payment, the kind of relationship that didn't generate drama because both sides understood what the arrangement was and respected it. Ethan had managed the Clearwater relationship personally for 4 of those 6 years. He knew their logistics coordinator, a methodical man named Frank Deller, well enough to have had 2 conversations at industry events that had gone on longer than they needed to and touched on things other than freight. Frank was the kind of person who noticed when his point of contact changed and who considered continuity a feature rather than a formality. When Frank called Brighton on December 22nd with a question about a Q1 contract renewal and was transferred to Phil, who then transferred him to a junior coordinator named Gwen, who had been at the company 8 months, and then to Trevor's voicemail. Frank called back the next morning, spoke to Trevor directly, and said, with characteristic mildness, that Clearwater was going to explore some alternatives for the coming quarter and would be in touch. Trevor said all the right things. Frank said all the right things back. The call ended politely. Trevor hung up and sat at his desk and did not move for about 45 seconds. Then he went upstairs to Marcus's office and did not knock. Clearwater, he said from the doorway. Marcus looked up from his laptop. Frank Deller just told me they're exploring alternatives. Trevor came in and closed the door behind him. Politely. Which means they've already decided, and the polite call is the professional courtesy before the formal notice. Marcus set down his pen. That's a mid-6-figure account, Trevor said. I know what it is. Do you know why it's walking? Trevor said. He wasn't raising his voice. He had no need to. Frank Deller worked with Ethan Caldwell for 4 years. He called in with a renewal question and got bounced between 3 people, none of whom knew him, none of whom knew the account history, and none of whom were Ethan. He stopped. Frank didn't say that. He was too professional to say that. But that's what happened. The office was quiet. Through the windows, the city was doing its usual thing, indifferent to the interior drama of a mid-sized freight company on the 23rd of December. Call Caldwell, Trevor said. Marcus was silent for a moment that went on long enough to be a statement of its own. Then he said, Do you have a number for him? I have his cell, Trevor said. I'm asking for authorization to reach out on behalf of the company. Another pause. Make the call, Marcus said. Ethan was in a coffee shop on Carlisle Street when his phone rang with Trevor's number. He'd been there most of the morning. It was a place he'd started coming to since returning from Roanoke, a corner spot with decent Wi-Fi and coffee that was better than what he made at home, where he'd been working through some things, job applications, mostly. The conversation with Daniel Cho at Glen Ridge had happened the previous week, a video call that had gone better than Ethan had expected, relaxed and substantive, the kind of conversation where both sides were actually listening, nothing finalized, but real. He stared at Trevor's name on his phone screen for 3 rings. Then he answered. Trevor, he said. Ethan. Trevor's voice was the same as always, unhurried, a little rough, the voice of someone who'd been on a lot of calls over a lot of years. How's your mother? She's recovering, Ethan said. Surgery went fine. She's home. Good. I'm glad. A beat. I'm going to skip the preamble because you're a straight-ahead kind of person and you deserve a straight-ahead conversation. We're having a hard December. Ethan looked out the coffee shop window at the street. A woman was walking a very small dog in a very large coat, and they both looked miserable about the cold in exactly the same way. "I heard," Ethan said. "Did you?" "Industry's small, Trevor." "Fair enough." Trevor paused. "I'm calling to ask if you'd be open to a conversation about returning, on different terms." Ethan picked up his coffee cup and found it was empty and set it back down. "What terms are you thinking?" "Whatever makes it worth your while," Trevor said. "I mean that straightforwardly. There's been a recognition, at a senior level, of the value of what you contributed and the circumstances under which you left. I think there's a genuine willingness to correct that." "A genuine willingness," Ethan said. "For Marcus as well," Trevor said. "I won't tell you it was an easy sell, but we lost Clearwater last week." There was a silence on the line. "I'm sorry to hear that," Ethan said, and he meant it in the complicated way that a person means something that is both true and also not fully their problem anymore. "6-year account," Trevor said. "Frank Deller. He didn't say your name, but he didn't have to." Ethan was quiet for a moment. The coffee shop made its ambient noises around him. The hiss of the espresso machine, someone's laptop keys, two women at the next table discussing something in low, intent voices. "Trevor," Ethan said, "I appreciate the call. I genuinely do. And I have a lot of respect for you. But I need to be honest with you. I'm in conversations with another company right now, and they're going well. Before I have any kind of discussion with Brighton, I'd want to know that what happened in December, not just my mother's situation, but the pattern of the last 4 months, was actually understood and not just inconvenient." "What would that look like to you?" Trevor asked. "It would look like a conversation with Marcus, not about terms, just a real conversation about what happened." He paused. "If he's willing to have that, then I'm willing to listen. If this is about getting me back in the seat because of Clearwater, I'm not interested." Trevor was quiet for a beat. "That's fair," he said. "I'll take it back." "Okay," Ethan said. "And Ethan," Trevor's voice shifted slightly. "For what it's worth, from me, personally, the way it went down was wrong. You should hear that from more people than just me. But you should hear it from me regardless." Ethan looked down at his empty coffee cup. "I appreciate that, Trevor," he said. "I really do." He sat in the coffee shop for a while after the call ended, ordered another coffee, thought about the conversation the way he thought about routing problems, methodically, from multiple angles, looking for the thing that wasn't obvious at first. He wasn't sure what he felt. He'd expected that a call from Brighton would produce a cleaner reaction, anger, or satisfaction, or the particular vindication of being proven right. What he actually felt was more complicated and less satisfying. There was no pleasure in the Clearwater news. He'd worked that account. He knew Frank Deller's professional habits and the specifics of what Clearwater needed and the particular way Frank liked to be communicated with. And the fact that all of that had dissolved the moment Ethan walked out was not a victory. It was just a loss, the kind that happens when things aren't built to last beyond one person. He thought about going back. He held the idea up and examined it from different directions, trying to be honest with himself about what was pulling at him. Some of it was genuine. He'd spent 9 years at Brighton, and there was a real attachment to the work, to the clients, to the institutional knowledge he'd built. Some of it was habit, the same habit that had kept him there 6 months past when he should have left. The deep groove of familiarity that felt like belonging, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. And some of it, if he was being fully honest, was fear. The Glenridge conversation had gone well, but nothing was finalized. The new was always uncertain in a way the familiar wasn't, even when the familiar was the problem. He opened his laptop and pulled up the email thread with Daniel Cho. He typed a brief message. "The timeline on my end has accelerated slightly. Do you have availability for a follow-up call this week?" He sent it before he could talk himself out of it. Then he closed the laptop and finished his coffee and watched the street outside. The woman with the small dog had made it around the block and was coming back, and the dog appeared to have reached some kind of accommodation with the cold, because it was moving faster now, with more conviction. Ethan put on his coat and walked home. Meanwhile, on the 3rd floor of Brighton Freight Solutions, the whiteboard was still there. Nobody had erased it. That was the thing that Diane noticed and didn't say out loud but thought about more than once over the following days. The color-coded routing maps in blue and red and green, the carrier windows and delivery clusters, and the shorthand notation that Ethan had developed over years, And that meant something to him and to anyone who'd worked alongside him long enough to learn the system, which was basically nobody else. It stood in the corner of the floor like an exhibit of something that was gone, but hadn't quite been acknowledged as gone yet. Phil had tried to use it once, on the second week. He'd stood in front of it with a dry erase marker for about 3 minutes, and then put the cap back on and walked away. Because the existing annotations were organized in a logic he couldn't fully reverse engineer, and writing over them felt like destroying something he didn't understand well enough to destroy. So the whiteboard stayed. And the third floor worked around it, and the December volume pressed down on everyone, and 2 more minor client issues surfaced in the week before Christmas. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that made the news. Just the kind of friction that accumulates when the person who knew how to prevent it is no longer there. Small things. A missed escalation window. A billing dispute that took 4 calls to resolve instead of 1. An email from a carrier partner asking to speak with Ethan specifically, which Trevor had to answer by explaining that Ethan was unavailable, which was technically accurate and practically felt like lying. Marcus Whitmore spent most of that week in meetings. External meetings, mostly. The kind with people from outside the company who carried briefcases and spoke in the language of strategic positioning. He did not spend a lot of time on the third floor. When he did come through, he moved the way he always moved, with the deliberate purposefulness of someone who believes that how you carry yourself in a room is a form of communication. But Diane, who had been watching people at Brighton for 11 years, noticed that he paused when he passed Ethan's corner, just briefly. Not long enough to call it stopping, just the slight hesitation of a person who is used to being decisive in countering something they haven't fully resolved. He looked at the whiteboard once, from a distance, not moving toward it. Just looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you're not sure yet how to classify. Then he moved on. Oh, the call between Marcus and Ethan happened on the 27th of December, a Thursday, 3 days after Christmas. Ethan had proposed the call, or rather, he'd said he was open to a conversation, and Trevor had set it up, and the logistics of that had involved a certain amount of back and forth that Trevor navigated without complaint. Ethan was in his apartment. It was a gray morning, the week between Christmas and New Year's, that always had a provisional, slightly unreal quality. The old year not quite over, the new one not quite started, everything temporarily suspended. He answered at the agreed time. Marcus was already on the line when the call connected, which Ethan noted. Ethan, Marcus said. Marcus. A pause, which Ethan did not fill. He'd learned, over the course of his career, that the most useful thing you could do in a difficult conversation was resist the instinct to smooth over the silence. I asked Trevor to set this up, Marcus said, because I thought a direct conversation was appropriate. I want to say, straightforwardly, that the way the situation in December was handled, your request for leave, my response, was wrong. I made a decision that prioritized operational convenience over a legitimate personal emergency, and that was the wrong call. Ethan listened. He hadn't been sure what he'd expected, something more defended maybe, or more hedged with qualifications. What he was hearing was closer to actual acknowledgement than he'd anticipated. I appreciate that, Ethan said. I mean that. I've also come to understand, Marcus continued, that the circumstances of your departure were the end of a pattern rather than an isolated incident, that I hadn't been, that the way I'd been running the operation hadn't given sufficient weight to the people doing the work. There was something effortful in the way he said it, like a person reading a sentence in a language they're still learning, technically correct but not yet natural. Ethan recognized that. It didn't make it less real. I want to be honest with you, Ethan said. I've been talking to another company. The conversations are serious. I'm not in a position to make a decision based on this call alone. I understand that, Marcus said. What I would say is, Ethan paused, choosing words carefully. What I'd want, if I were to consider any kind of return, isn't just different terms. It's a different understanding about what the work actually requires, about the fact that the institutional knowledge in that building isn't in the systems, it's in the people, and you can't demand more from the people while treating them as variables. The line was quiet for a moment. That's fair, Marcus said. I'm not saying that to be difficult, Ethan said. I'm saying it because it's true, and because if it isn't actually understood, nothing changes. I know, Marcus said. And then, after a pause that felt genuine, I'm learning that. Ethan sat with that for a moment. Outside his window, the city was its usual self, gray and real and indifferent, going on regardless. "I'll think about it," Ethan said, genuinely. "That's all I can offer right now." "That's all I'm asking," Marcus said. They ended the call with the careful politeness of two people who had said real things and weren't sure yet what those things meant for what came next. Ethan set his phone down on the kitchen table and sat for a while in the quiet of his apartment. He thought about Trevor Gaines, who had sat down in Marcus's office without being invited and said what needed saying. He thought about Diane, who had covered what she could and brought banana bread on the first Friday, and sent 2 lines that mattered more than she probably knew. He thought about Frank Deller and Clearwater Distribution and the whiteboard on the 3rd floor that nobody had erased. He thought about Daniel Cho at Glen Ridge and the follow-up call they'd scheduled for the following Tuesday, and the particular quality of that conversation. The feeling, rare enough to notice, of being spoken to as a peer rather than managed as a resource. He got up and made coffee. He stood at the window and looked at the gray December street and drank it while it was still too hot, burning his tongue slightly the way he always did because he was never patient enough to wait, and thought about the fact that he had, for the first time in a long time, more than one door in front of him. It was an unfamiliar feeling. Not comfortable exactly, but something adjacent to it. The specific discomfort of a person who has been in a narrow space for a long time and is still adjusting to the room. The follow-up call with Daniel Cho happened on a Tuesday, the last day of the year. Outside Ethan's apartment window, the city was doing what cities do on December 31st, bracing itself for something that was mostly symbolic, but that people treated with genuine weight anyway, as if the calendar turning actually changed the physics of things. Ethan had made a second pot of coffee and cleared space at his kitchen table and set up his laptop with the Glen Ridge Logistics website open in one tab and his notes from the first conversation in another. Daniel Cho was 41, based out of Glen Ridge's main office in Harrisburg, and had the particular communication style of someone who had been in logistics long enough to have no patience for vagueness, but enough self-awareness to know that directness without warmth just made people defensive. He got on the video call 3 minutes early, which Ethan noticed. His background was an actual office, bookshelves, a whiteboard with actual writing on it, a coffee cup that looked like it had been refilled several times already. "Ethan," he said, "good to see you again." "You too," Ethan said. "How's your mother?" Ethan paused a beat. "She's doing well. Wrist is healing. She's already irritated about the physical therapy schedule, which I'm taking as a good sign." Daniel smiled. "My dad broke his collarbone 2 years ago. Same energy. The irritation means they're back." "Exactly," Ethan said. The small talk lasted about 90 seconds, and then Daniel moved, with the naturalness of someone who didn't need a formal gear shift, into the substance of things. Glen Ridge had been growing, not explosively, but steadily, the kind of growth that created structural strain in ways that were hard to see from the outside but obvious from within. They'd added 3 regional accounts in the last 14 months, and their operations infrastructure had not kept pace. What they needed was not someone to manage existing systems, but someone who could assess what was broken in those systems and fix it, ideally before it became a client-facing problem. "That's a different job description than what I had at Brighton," Ethan said. "I know," Daniel said. "Is that a problem?" Daniel said. "Is that a problem?" Ethan thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "It's actually closer to what I was doing anyway. The title didn't match the job." "That's what I heard," Daniel said. He paused. "I want to be straight with you about something. The reason I reached out wasn't just because you were available. I'd heard your name before from Frank Deller at Clearwater." Ethan went still for a moment. "Frank mentioned me?" "Not recently. This was about 1.5 years ago at the Mid-Atlantic Freight Conference in Baltimore. I was talking to Frank about carrier relationships and he mentioned you by name, said you were the best operations contact he'd worked with in the regional space. Said you had the kind of institutional knowledge that usually walks out the door when people retire." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "When I heard you'd left Brighton, I thought it was worth making the call." Ethan sat with that for a moment. Frank Deller, the methodical man who didn't give unnecessary compliments, and who had just told Brighton he was exploring alternatives, had said that about him at a conference 1.5 years ago. In a conversation that had nothing to do with Ethan. In a conversation Ethan hadn't known about. "I didn't know Frank said that," Ethan said. People say things about you when you're not in the room, Daniel said. The useful ones are what you hear when you're not there to manage the impression. It was a good line. Ethan wrote it down without thinking, an old habit, and then felt faintly self-conscious about it. Daniel either didn't notice or chose not to comment. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. About Glenridge's specific operational gaps, 3 of them, in Ethan's assessment after listening for 30 minutes, and he said so, which seemed to land well. About the structure of the role, the reporting lines, the degree of autonomy involved in the position. About compensation, which Daniel handled without awkwardness, laying out the number plainly and saying there was room to discuss it and meaning it. At the end, Daniel said, "Where are you?" "In terms of the decision?" "Yeah." Ethan leaned back. "I had a conversation with Brighton last week. They've acknowledged what happened and expressed interest in my returning. I'm taking it seriously." Daniel nodded. He didn't look rattled by this, which Ethan had half expected and which he respected. "What would make the difference?" Daniel asked. "Honestly," Ethan said, "the conversation with you feels different, but different isn't the same as better until I've had more time with it." "Fair," Daniel said. "Take the time you need. I'd rather you make the right decision than a fast one." He paused. "But I'll also say, we can move quickly when we need to. If Brighton makes you an offer and you want to come back to me before you decide, call me the same day. I'd rather lose a week than lose the candidate." Ethan said he appreciated that. He meant it. They ended the call, and Ethan sat at his kitchen table in the last afternoon of the year and looked at his notes and tried to think clearly about what he actually wanted, which was harder than it sounded because what he actually wanted was something he'd spent 9 years not fully asking himself. The thing about being good at a job for a long time is that the job becomes part of how you understand yourself. Not in a way you necessarily choose, it just happens, gradually, the way any long habit becomes infrastructure. Ethan had been the person who kept Brighton running for so long that he'd started to experience the two things as synonymous. Brighton's problems were his problems. Brighton's clients were his responsibility. Brighton's operational gaps were his to fill. Whether or not filling them was technically in his job description or compensated or even acknowledged. He recognized this, sitting at his kitchen table on December 31st. He recognized it in the specific way you recognize something you've known for a while but haven't been willing to look at directly. The way you know, without letting yourself fully know, that a relationship has run past its natural end. His phone buzzed. A text from Nora. "Happy almost New Year. Mom says hi and that you should eat more. I concur. Call us tomorrow." He typed back. "Tell her I'm eating fine. I'll call tomorrow." A few seconds passed and then, "She doesn't believe you about the eating. I don't either." He put the phone down and went to the kitchen and made himself actual dinner. Pasta, from scratch. Something he almost never did on weeknights because it required time he used to not have. He stood at the stove and listened to the water come to a boil and thought about what Daniel Cho had said about Frank Deller and the conference in Baltimore. The useful ones are what you hear when you're not there to manage the impression. He thought about the 23 pages of handoff notes, about the folder he'd kept for months, documenting every reasonable proposal that had been tabled, about Terrence, who had brought his daughter in for Take Your Child to Work Day, and whose desk had sat empty for 2 weeks before anyone cleared it, about the nor'easter in 42 hours and 3 days, and a reprimand for a transposed digit, about the meeting with Marcus and the question, is it life-threatening, and the precise clinical flatness of that framing. He ate dinner at the kitchen table with the television off. He washed his dishes. He went to bed before midnight because he'd never had much use for countdowns. January arrived with 2 inches of snow and the particular stillness that follows a holiday period, the traffic lighter than usual. The city's noise pitched slightly lower, people returning to things gradually, reluctantly, as if the routine needed to be eased back into rather than resumed all at once. Ethan used the first week to think. He walked a lot, which was a new habit, or maybe an old one he'd let go. He'd walked everywhere before Brighton started consuming his evenings, and walking turned out to be useful for the kind of thinking that didn't work at a desk. He walked the length of Calder Avenue and back, past the coffee shop on Carlisle, where he'd taken Daniel's call in the diner 2 blocks over where he sometimes had breakfast. And he thought about the 2 things in front of him and tried to be honest about which one he was choosing for the right reasons and which one he might be choosing out of the old habit of loyalty that his mother had called a habit rather than a value. On the 8th of January, he called Trevor. "I want to meet with Marcus," he said. "In person. Not another phone call." Trevor was quiet for a beat. "Okay," he said. "When?" "Whenever he's available." "I'll make him available," Trevor said. "Give me a day." Trevor called back 4 hours later with a time. Thursday, 11 in the morning, Marcus's office. "Should I be there?" Trevor asked. Ethan thought about it. "No," he said. "I think it should be just us." He drove to Brighton on Thursday morning through light traffic, parked in the lot he'd parked in for 9 years, and sat in the car for about 2 minutes before he went in. He wasn't nervous exactly. He'd been thinking about this conversation for 2 weeks, and he knew what he wanted to say. What he was feeling was closer to a kind of deliberate calm, the state you reach when you've considered something from enough angles that you've stopped being afraid of the angles you haven't thought of yet. The lobby was the same. Priya was at the front desk and looked up when he walked in, and her expression went through several things very quickly before settling on something professionally composed. "Hi, Ethan," she said. "Hi, Priya," he said. "I have a meeting with Marcus at 11. I'll let him know you're here." He took the elevator to the 4th floor, stood in the hallway outside Marcus's office. Through the glass wall, he could see Marcus at his desk, on the phone, the same clean desk, the same large windows looking out over the same gray January city. The city looked the same. The office looked the same. The whole floor had the particular quality of a place that had been continuing in his absence in the flat, mechanical way that workplaces do. Still there, still running, not rebuilt around the shape of his absence, but not unchanged by it either. Marcus ended his call and looked up and waved him in. Ethan came in and sat down without being invited to, the way Trevor had sat down without being invited to, which he'd thought about consciously before doing it. Small things communicate. "Ethan," Marcus said. "Marcus." He put nothing on the desk. He'd brought nothing but himself. "I appreciate you making time." "Of course." Marcus had the slightly different quality of a person who'd been preparing for this conversation, a quality Ethan recognized because he'd been preparing too. More careful, more present, less of the practiced indifference he used to deploy. "How are you doing?" "Better," Ethan said. "I've had time to think, which is something I hadn't had much of for a while." Marcus nodded. "That's something I've been sitting with. The conversation we had in December, the leave request. I handled it badly." "Yes," Ethan said simply. Not to be unkind, just because there wasn't a more accurate word. Marcus didn't flinch from it. "I had a framing in my head when I came into this role, about what efficiency meant, about what it looked like to run an operation well. And that framing, I applied it to situations where it didn't fit." Ethan looked at him. "Can I ask you something directly?" "Go ahead." "When you looked at the 3rd floor in those first weeks when you were walking the floors and assessing things, did you see the people? Or did you see positions?" The question landed and sat there in the middle of the room. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Ethan watched him work through it, not looking for the right answer to give, which would have been visible in a different way, but actually sitting with the question. "Positions," Marcus said finally. "Mostly. I saw the structure, the coverage ratios, the output per head count." He paused. "I saw Terrence Holbrook as a redundancy in the dispatch model, not as someone who had 7 years of carrier relationship history in his head." "He did," Ethan said. "Some of those carrier contacts are personal. They'll take his calls. They won't necessarily take someone they don't know." "I understand that now. It cost you something when he left. It was just a cost that showed up slowly, and slowly is harder to attribute to a specific decision." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "The way this kind of work functions, the institutional knowledge, the relationship capital, the systems that exist in people's heads rather than in any software, it doesn't show up on an efficiency chart until it's gone. And by then the decision that caused the gap is 3 or 4 steps back, and it's hard to connect them." Marcus was listening. Actually listening, Ethan noticed. Not the performative listening of a person waiting for the other person to finish, but the slightly effortful listening of someone who is revising something. "The Columbus Carrier invoice," Marcus said. "The Hargrove dock situation. Clearwater." "I'm not saying those to be vindicated," Ethan said. "I'm not here for that. I'm saying it because you asked to understand what happened, and that's what happened. It's not about me specifically. It's about the fact that when you treat the people who carry institutional knowledge as interchangeable units, the knowledge doesn't transfer. It just disappears. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Outside the windows, the January city sat under its gray winter light, the same view it had always been. Trevor said something to me, Marcus said slowly, after the Clearwater call. He said the people we regret losing, we always know we'll regret it before they're out the door. That the question is whether we do anything about it. He paused. I knew when you walked out of this building. I don't know if I've admitted that to myself until right now. Ethan sat with that. Why didn't you stop it? He asked, not accusing, genuinely asking. Marcus was quiet for longer this time. Because stopping it would have meant admitting the decision in your office was wrong before I had the data that proved it was wrong. And I haven't been good at that. Changing course in the middle of something because I can see it's wrong rather than waiting until I can prove it's wrong. He looked at Ethan steadily. That's the honest answer. It was more honest than Ethan had expected. He sat there and felt something complicated about it. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implied something that had been done to him personally, and this had been more than that. Had been something done to the whole floor, to Terrence, and the 43 people who'd been quietly absorbing the pressure of a management philosophy that saw them as positions. But something adjacent to understanding, the specific understanding you reach when a person shows you a flaw they haven't dressed up or rationalized. I'm considering another offer, Ethan said. I want to be clear about that. The conversation I'm having with that company is serious, and the role is a good fit. I know, Marcus said. Trevor told me. I expected that. If I were to come back here, Ethan said, it would have to be on a different understanding, not just different terms, though that's part of it, but a different operating principle. The people on that floor are not interchangeable. The work they carry in their heads is not replaceable by a coverage plan. If that isn't a structural change in how this company is run, then the conversation we're having right now is just about getting me back in a seat, and that's not something I'm interested in. Marcus nodded. What would the structural change look like? Documentation requirements, real ones, not pro forma. Every senior coordinator should have their institutional knowledge in a transferable format so that if someone leaves, the knowledge doesn't leave with them. Better. It protects the company, and it stops individual people from being indispensable in a way that burns them out. Ethan paused. Leave policy that treats personal emergencies as what they are. A feedback channel that actually goes somewhere, not an email that gets filed. And Trevor in the room when major operational decisions get made. He understands this company in ways that don't show up in whatever the consultants from Apex told you. Marcus was quiet for a moment after that. Not the silence of a person pushing back, more like someone who was actually taking inventory. I can commit to that conversation, Marcus said. Not as a promise that everything you've listed happens tomorrow, but as a genuine commitment to working through it. He paused. I'd want you involved in building it, the documentation framework especially. That can't come from the top down. It has to come from someone who understands the work. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. I'll think about it, he said. I'm going to have one more conversation with the other company before I make any decision. I told you that up front, and I'm not changing that. That's fair, Marcus said. I mean that. Ethan stood. Marcus stood too, which Ethan noticed, a small adjustment in the choreography from the meeting in December, when Marcus had stayed seated and waited for Ethan to show himself out. They shook hands. Thank you for coming in, Marcus said. I know it wasn't... He paused. I know it took something. It did, Ethan said, but it was worth knowing where things actually stood. He walked out of the office and down the hallway toward the elevator. As he passed the elevator bank, he almost stopped, almost pushed the button for the third floor, almost walked through to see the whiteboard, and Diane, and the familiar corner of the floor where he'd spent 9 years. He didn't. It didn't feel like the right moment for that. There was something in between where he was now and wherever he was going, and he needed to stay in that in-between for a little longer rather than resolving it prematurely. He rode the elevator to the lobby, waved to Priya, pushed through the glass doors into the January cold. He called Daniel Cho that afternoon. Daniel picked up on the second ring. Ethan, good timing. I was just about to send you an email. Good email or administrative email? Good email. We finalized the role structure this morning. I was going to send you the formal offer letter. A pause. But let me guess. You just came from Brighton. This morning, Ethan said. And? Ethan walked while he talked, the way he'd been doing this month. Down Calder Avenue, past the coffee shop, into the quieter residential blocks where the snow was still clean on the front yards. Marcus Whitmore is not the person he was in December, Ethan said. I don't know if that holds. It's easy to have a different quality of conversation when you're losing accounts. The test is whether it holds when things are going well again. And you can't know that yet, Daniel said. No. So what are you leaning toward? Ethan stopped walking. He was standing on a residential block he didn't know particularly well, in front of a house with a blue door and a snow-covered garden, and a kid's bike was leaning against the porch railing with a coating of snow on the seat. And it was just a house on a street on a Thursday in January, and something about the ordinariness of it made him feel suddenly very clear. I'm leaning toward you, Ethan said, but I want to hear the formal offer before I say yes. I'll send it tonight, Daniel said. He sounded neither triumphant nor relieved, which Ethan appreciated. Just the steady competence of a person who'd been doing this long enough to know that the right response to good news was to move forward efficiently. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Yeah. Did you know when you reached out that I'd have a conversation like this with Brighton, that they'd come back? A brief pause. I suspected, Daniel said. Companies like Brighton don't realize what they have until it's gone. You were there 9 years. That doesn't just walk out the door without consequences. Another pause. I was hoping you'd still choose us. I haven't signed anything yet, Ethan said. The offer will be in your inbox by 8, Daniel said. The offer was in his inbox at 7:43. It was a senior operations director role, 2 levels above his Brighton title, which was honest about what he'd actually been doing for the last several years, even if the title hadn't been. The compensation was 12% above what he'd been making, with a performance structure that was tied to measurable outcomes rather than pure hours logged. There was a clause about remote flexibility for personal emergencies that was written into the contract in plain language, not as a favor, but as a policy. He read it twice. He sat at the kitchen table and drafted a brief counter, not because the offer was insufficient, but because he'd learned in 9 years of operations work that accepting the first number without discussion was a signal that you didn't know your own value, and he did know it now in a way he hadn't been sure he knew it 6 weeks ago. The counter was modest. 2 points, a slightly higher base, and clarification on the scope of the carrier relationship portfolio he'd be inheriting. Both were reasonable. Both were things he genuinely needed to know. He sent it at 10:30. Daniel replied at 10:48. Base accepted. We'll send updated carrier portfolio overview tomorrow. Welcome aboard, pending your signature. Ethan read the reply 3 times. He called Nora. She picked up on the 3rd ring, and he could hear the television in the background, the end of some show, and one of the kids saying something muffled. Hey, she said. Everything okay? Yeah, he said. I took a new job. A pause. Then she said, Tell me. He told her. She listened without interrupting, which was the thing about Nora. She had Howard Briggs's quality of not filling silences prematurely, and it occurred to Ethan that he'd never noticed the similarity before, that 2 of the people in his life he found easiest to talk to shared that particular restraint. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. How do you feel? She said. He thought about it. Outside the window, the January night was cold and clear, the kind of clear that only happened after a cold snap settled in properly, and he could see stars from his apartment, which you couldn't always. Like I made a decision that's actually mine, he said, not out of habit, not out of loyalty that had outlasted its reasons. He paused. Like I chose something instead of staying in something. Nora was quiet for a beat. Mom's going to want you to call her, she said. Not tomorrow, tonight. It's almost 11. She'll be up. He laughed. A short, genuine one. Okay. Ethan. Her voice went quieter. I'm proud of you. Not for the job. For the part before the job. He didn't have a clean answer for that. He just said, Thanks, Nor. He called his mother. She picked up on the first ring, which confirmed that Nora had texted her already, and she said, "Tell me," in exactly the same words Nora had used, which was either coincidence or proof that the two of them talked more than they let on. He told her. She listened. "Is it a good company?" she said when he finished. "I think so," he said. "I think they actually mean the things they say." "You'll find out," she said, not unkindly. "You always do." "Yeah," he said. "That's how it works." She told him to get some sleep. He said he would. He sat on the couch after they hung up and looked at the ceiling of his apartment on Mercer Street, the same ceiling he'd stared at in the dark on the morning of the nor'easter, running on no sleep and the operational stubbornness that had kept him going through crises for 9 years, and thought about how different the ceiling looked when you weren't trying to figure out how to keep everything from falling apart. He had signed nothing yet, but he already felt like he was somewhere else. He signed the offer letter on a Friday morning in the second week of January at his kitchen table, with the pen his father had given him at college graduation. The simple ballpoint with his initials engraved, the one he'd kept in the pencil cup at Brighton for 9 years and almost never used because he was afraid of losing it. He used it now. It seemed like the right instrument for the occasion. He sent the signed letter back to Daniel Cho at 8:47 in the morning and then sat there for a while with the pen in his hand, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting in the quiet of the apartment the way you sit after something that took a long time finally concludes. Not relief, exactly. Something more settled than relief. The particular stillness of a person who has stopped bracing for impact. He called Trevor that afternoon. Not to announce anything formally. He'd already sent Brighton a written resignation, brief and professional, thanking them for 9 years and wishing them well, the kind of letter that said everything it needed to say and nothing it didn't. He called Trevor because Trevor had been the person who sat down without being invited, who made the call that didn't have to be made, who said, for me personally, it was wrong when he didn't have to say that either. Trevor picked up on the third ring. "I figured this was coming," Trevor said, before Ethan had said anything beyond his name. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. "Don't be." A pause and the sound of Trevor's chair adjusting the way it always did when he leaned back. "Is it a good opportunity?" "I think so. Glen Ridge, operations director." "Daniel Cho," Trevor said. "You know him?" "I know of him. Good reputation. Runs a tight operation." Another pause. "He's lucky to have you." "I'm lucky to have the job," Ethan said. "Both things can be true," Trevor said, simply. The way a person says something simple when they mean it. Ethan looked out his window at the January street. A delivery truck was idling at the corner, hazard lights blinking in the gray afternoon, the driver checking something on a clipboard. The ordinary logistics of the world, moving things from one place to another, people in the middle of it doing work that nobody saw. "Take care of the floor, Trevor," Ethan said. "Working on it," Trevor said. "Marcus, it's different now. I don't know if it's permanent, but it's different." "I hope it holds," Ethan said. And he meant that too, in the complicated way he'd meant things recently, genuinely and without the expectation that meaning something made it true. "It'll hold as long as it costs him something not to," Trevor said. "That's how it always works." That was the truest thing anyone had said about it. Ethan filed it away and they said goodbye. And that was the last conversation he had with anyone at Brighton Freight Solutions for a long time. His first day at Glen Ridge was on the 21st of January, a Monday, which was either appropriately symbolic or just how calendar math worked out, and he chose not to overthink it. The Glen Ridge office was in a converted warehouse space on the north side of the city, not glamorous, but functional in a way that felt considered rather than neglected. Exposed ceiling, good natural light, desks arranged without the rigid grid formality of Brighton's floor plan, the kind of layout that had developed organically over time as people figured out how they actually needed to work rather than how a facilities manager thought they should. There were plants near the windows, real ones that looked lived in and slightly imperfect, not the decorative kind placed for optics. Daniel met him at the front and walked him through the space with the ease of someone who wasn't performing a welcome but was genuinely showing him around. He introduced him to people by name, with 1 or 2 personal details that made clear Daniel actually knew his staff, not in the managed HR-trained way of a manager who had memorized names for retention metrics, but in the way of someone who had been paying attention. "This is Sue Yan," Daniel said, stopping at a desk near the operations cluster. "She handles our carrier relationships in the Northeast Corridor. She's been trying to untangle the Meridian contract for 2 months and is currently winning. Suyan looked up. She was maybe 30, with the specific kind of focused look of someone interrupted in the middle of concentrated work, who had decided to be pleasant about it anyway. "Barely winning," she said. "If you have any insight on Meridian's rate adjustment clauses, I will buy you coffee indefinitely." "I might have some insight on that," Ethan said. "Then you're already my favorite person here," she said, and went back to her screen. It was a small thing, but it was the right small thing, and Ethan noted it the way he noted the plants and the layout, and the way Daniel had said she's been trying to untangle rather than she hasn't fixed it yet. The particular language of a place where problems were treated as problems to be solved, rather than evidence of individual inadequacy. He spent the first week in the way he always started new things, quietly, observing more than acting, building a map of how things actually worked before touching anything. He asked questions that were more diagnostic than social, the way a doctor takes a history before forming an opinion. He sat in on 2 client calls and 1 carrier negotiation and said almost nothing, just listened. He ate lunch with different people on different days. He read the documentation, all of it, including the stuff that clearly hadn't been updated in 18 months, which was its own form of information. By Friday afternoon, he had a list. Not of problems. He was careful about that framing, even internally, because problems implied fault, and the goal wasn't fault, it was function. A list of gaps. Places where Glenridge's operational reality had grown past its infrastructure, where the scaffolding hadn't kept up with the building. 7 items, in order of urgency and impact. He sent the list to Daniel with a note. First week observations. Happy to walk through any of these whenever you have time. Nothing on fire, but a few things worth addressing before they get there. Daniel replied in 12 minutes. Let's do Monday morning, all 7. Bring coffee. Ethan read the reply and felt something he took a moment to identify, because it had been absent long enough that he'd stopped expecting it. It was the feeling of working in a place where bringing the list was the right thing to do, where the person receiving the list would read it as useful rather than as criticism, where the response time of 12 minutes meant, "I'm paying attention," rather than "you've made me uncomfortable." He went home that Friday evening at a reasonable hour. Made dinner. Called his mother, who reported that the physical therapy was less irritating now that she'd decided the therapist was competent, which was her highest form of professional approval. He watched something on television that he couldn't remember afterward. He went to bed without his phone on the nightstand, a new habit, and slept through to 6:15 without the alarm. He hadn't done that in years. The weeks that followed were not frictionless. That would be dishonest to say. The gaps in Glenridge's infrastructure were real, and closing them took the kind of sustained effort that can't be fully prepared for in advance. Long days when something broke in a way he hadn't anticipated. Client conversations where his credibility was still provisional, because trust in a new face takes time, regardless of your track record. Moments of frustration when the institutional knowledge he'd built at Brighton didn't transfer directly because the systems here worked differently, and some of what he knew was Brighton-specific rather than universal. There was a week in February where a carrier partnership on the Western accounts went sideways in a way that had roots in a contract clause. Nobody had flagged 18 months back, and Ethan spent 3 days rebuilding the relationship from the ground up through a combination of very direct conversations and a rate concession that Daniel approved without making it feel like a judgment. He fixed it. But it cost him something to fix it, the way fixing things always costs something, and he sat at his desk on the Thursday evening after it was resolved and felt the specific flatness that follows a sustained effort. Not defeat, just the honest weight of having spent a lot of energy. Suyan walked past his desk on her way out and stopped. "Meridian's resolved," she said. "I wanted to tell you in person." "Good," he said. "You look terrible," she said in the tone of a colleague rather than a concern. "Thank you," he said. "The Western thing is done," she said. "I heard. You handled it." It took 3 days longer than it should have. "Most things do." She picked up her bag. "Go home, Ethan." He looked up at her. The phrasing was so familiar, so exactly what Diane used to say, on the exact same cadence, that for a moment he had the strange doubling sensation of being simultaneously in 2 different places. "Yeah," he said, "I will." He did. Marcus Whitmore visited Glenridge on a Thursday in late February. It wasn't announced in advance, at least not to Ethan. He found out when Daniel mentioned it at the end of a Monday meeting, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who doesn't think it should be a complicated thing. Marcus Whitmore from Brighton wants to come by Thursday, Daniel said. He reached out last week. Wants to see the operation, he said. I'm assuming it's also about you. Ethan considered this for a moment. Are you okay with that? I don't have anything to hide, Daniel said. And you've been here 6 weeks. If he wants to see where you landed, that's between the two of you. I just thought you should know. I appreciate that, Ethan said. Marcus arrived Thursday at 11. He came alone, which Ethan had half expected. No Trevor, no consultant from Apex Strategy Group, just Marcus in a coat that looked expensive and slightly wrong for the weather, the way people who spend a lot of time in controlled indoor environments misjudge outdoor temperatures. Daniel greeted him and gave him a brief walkthrough of the space, the same easy, genuine walkthrough he'd given Ethan on his first day. Marcus was attentive. He asked good questions, more operational than Ethan expected, more specific. He looked at the layout and the carrier board and the documentation framework Ethan had started building, which was up on a shared screen near the operations cluster, color-coded in a way that would have looked familiar to anyone who'd spent time near a certain whiteboard on a third floor across the city. Ethan watched him see it, watched something register. Eventually, Daniel excused himself with the naturalness of a person who understood when to leave a room, and Ethan and Marcus were standing near the windows with coffee cups, the north side of the city visible in the late February light. Still gray, but a different gray than December, the kind that carried the first faint suggestion of something warmer coming. You built this fast, Marcus said, nodding toward the documentation board. It's a start, Ethan said. It'll take another month to get the carrier section right. Marcus nodded. He looked around the space, at Suyeon's desk, where she was on the phone with someone and taking notes with the focused efficiency of a person who didn't know she was being observed, at the plants by the windows. It's a good operation, Marcus said. It's getting there, Ethan said. A pause. The city outside went about its business. I wanted to see it, Marcus said. Where you are. What you're doing. He paused. I think I needed to see that it was real, that this... He stopped, which was unusual for him. Marcus Whitmore was not generally a person who ran out of words. I made a significant error in judgment, not just about you, about the philosophy I brought into Brighton. He looked at Ethan steadily. I've been working with Trevor to address the things you named in January, the documentation requirements, the leave policy, the feedback structure. It's slow. Those things are always slow, Ethan said. Terrence Holbrook, Marcus said. I looked at his file after you left. 7 years. Carrier relationships across 4 regional hubs. We lost 2 of those carrier contacts within 60 days of his departure. He said it plainly, not as confession, but as accounting. I should have understood that before I made the call. I didn't. Ethan looked at him. The man standing in front of him was recognizably the same person who had sat behind the clean desk in December and asked, Is it life-threatening with that clinical flatness? Same face, same bearing. But there was something different in the way he was holding himself. Less managed, less positioned. The particular quality of a person who has been made uncomfortable enough by their own behavior to let it actually cost them something. I appreciate you coming here to say that, Ethan said. In person. It seemed right, Marcus said. They stood there for a moment in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have said the difficult things and don't need to fill the aftermath with noise. How's the floor? Ethan said. Adjusting, Marcus said. Phil is developing. Trevor is Trevor. Something that might have been a smile, brief and genuine. Diane is still bringing banana bread on the first Friday. Ethan felt something warm and specific at that. Good, he said. She should. Marcus finished his coffee. He looked at the documentation board one more time. The color coding, he said. It's the same system. It works, Ethan said. I called it redundant, Marcus said. I know. It wasn't redundant. I know that too, Ethan said. They shook hands before Marcus left. Firm, brief, the handshake of 2 people who had been through something and come out on the other side of it changed in ways they couldn't fully articulate yet. Ethan walked him to the door and watched him cross the parking lot to his car. Coat slightly wrong for the weather, posture still deliberate, still the bearing of a man who believed presentation communicated something, and then disappear into the gray February afternoon. He went back to his desk and sat down and looked at the documentation board and thought about the strange shape of how things had unfolded. Not clean, not how he'd have written it if he'd been writing it, but real, which was the only kind of ending that actually held up over time. Here's what Ethan Caldwell understood, eventually, about the years at Brighton and the months that followed. He understood that he had been good at his job in a way that had made him complicit in his own erosion. The better you are at absorbing pressure, the more pressure finds you, and after long enough you stop noticing the weight, because it has become simply the condition of your existence. He had stayed 9 years, not purely out of loyalty, but out of a fear of the unknown dressed up as loyalty. The story he'd told himself about commitment and dedication was partly true and partly a more comfortable narrative than I'm afraid to find out if I'm valuable somewhere that doesn't already know me. He understood that institutions change when they're forced to change, not when it's the right thing to do, and that the forcing usually involves loss. Brighton changed because Clearwater left, because the carrier invoices accumulated, because the whiteboard on the 3rd floor became an exhibit of something irreplaceable that nobody had thought to protect until it was gone. He didn't think of this with bitterness. It was just how it worked. Organizations, like people, learn from consequences more than from principle. And the question isn't whether they'll learn, but whether the lesson comes in time to matter. He understood that Trevor Gaines was the kind of person every organization needed and rarely fully valued, someone who understood the gap between what was said in the 4th floor office and what was true on the 3rd floor, and who was willing to occupy that gap at personal cost. He thought about Trevor often in the months that followed, with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite admiration, but was somewhere in the middle of both. Understood that leaving, when it finally happened, had looked nothing like he'd expected. He had imagined, when he'd imagined it at all, something dramatic, a confrontation, a declaration, a clean break with clear edges. What it actually was a Tuesday morning, a phone call from his sister, a box of ordinary things carried through a lobby, and a drive down a winter highway to sit with his injured mother in a hospital room in Roanoke. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just human, in all the plain, unglamorous ways that the most important things tend to be. And he understood this, which was the thing he carried forward most clearly. The value you bring to a place is not measured by what they pay you or what your title says or how many years you stayed. It's measured by what they lose when you go. And if you've spent years building something real, relationships, knowledge, systems that work, trust earned one interaction at a time, then what they lose when you go is substantial, regardless of whether anyone named it while you were there. The hard truth that cut both ways was this: the same qualities that made him valuable had also made it possible for the company to take that value for granted. Because he had never left before. Because he always covered the gap. Because the work got done, quietly, without making a scene about the cost of getting it done. He had been, in a way, too reliable for his own good. And reliability, when it isn't reciprocated, becomes a one-way arrangement that only one side calls loyalty. That was not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it was true. And true things are worth sitting with even when they're uncomfortable. In March, Nora came to visit with the kids for a long weekend. They ate takeout on Ethan's living room floor because he didn't have a dining table large enough, and the kids fell asleep on the couch, in the chaotic, immediate way of children who are not yet self-conscious about falling asleep in places. And Nora and Ethan sat on the floor with the leftover containers between them and talked quietly in the way they talked when they had time and space, and the particular ease of siblings who had long since stopped needing to perform for each other. "You look different," Nora said. "Different how?" She thought about it. "Less like you're calculating load-bearing capacity." He laughed at that. A real one. That's specific. "You always had this look," she said, "like you were constantly running numbers, like there was always something you were keeping from falling." She looked at him. "You don't have it right now." He considered that. Outside the window, March was beginning to argue with February. Still cold, but inconsistently cold, with brief reprieves where the light had a different quality and you could almost believe something was coming. "I still run numbers." "I know, but they're different numbers." She refilled her glass. "Are you happy?" He turned the word over. It was one of those words that felt too large for honest answers and too small for complicated ones. I think I'm building something I actually want, he said. That's different from happiness, but it might be better. Nora looked at him for a long moment with the expression she'd had their whole lives, the one that meant she was considering whether to say the thing she was thinking. Say it, he said. I think you spent a long time being responsible for things that weren't yours to carry alone, she said. And I think you figured out the difference between responsibility and self-erasure. And I think that took longer than it should have, and I'm glad it happened. He didn't have a clean answer for that either. He just nodded, because it was accurate, and accuracy deserved acknowledgement even when you didn't have words for it. One of the kids shifted on the couch and murmured something in their sleep, some fragment of a dream, and then went still again. The apartment was warm. The city outside was its usual self, going on in the way cities do, indifferent and vast and full of the ordinary dramas of ordinary people trying to figure out what they're owed and what they owe and where the line is between those things. Ethan Caldwell sat on the floor of his apartment with his sister and the leftover containers and the sleeping children and thought, this is a life. Not a perfect one, not a clean one, but a real one, where his effort mattered and his judgment was trusted, and when something went wrong, it was a problem to be solved together rather than evidence of his individual inadequacy. He thought about the pen in his desk at the new office, the ballpoint with his initials that he'd used to sign the offer letter. He'd started using it daily now. Not for anything ceremonial, just because it was a good pen and it had been his father's, and keeping it in a cup and not touching it out of fear of loss had been, when he examined it honestly, a small and specific way of not letting himself have the things that were already his. He didn't do that anymore, or he was trying not to. It was a work in progress, the way most things worth doing are. He picked up the last spring roll from the container. Outside, the city kept going. The kids kept sleeping. The month kept turning towards something warmer. That was enough. That was, in the end, more than enough. The weeks after Nora's visit settled into a rhythm that Ethan hadn't experienced in so long he'd forgotten it was possible. Not the rhythm of managed crisis, the kind he'd lived inside at Brighton, where each day was a sequence of fires either burning or about to, but something slower and more sustainable, the rhythm of work that had room in it. He arrived at Glenridge at 8 most mornings. He left by 6 most evenings. Not because anyone was watching the clock, but because the volume of work, properly distributed across a team that was adequately staffed, actually fit inside those hours. That sounds simple. It wasn't to him. It took weeks to stop feeling like he was missing something, like there was a crisis somewhere that he was failing to address by going home at a reasonable hour. He mentioned this to Daniel in passing one afternoon, not as a complaint, just an observation. And Daniel had said, without looking up from his screen, that feeling means the old place broke something in you. It goes away. Give it time. He'd said it the way someone says a thing they know from experience, not theory, and Ethan had filed it away without asking for the backstory, because some things you understand without needing the context. The documentation framework he'd started in January was fully operational by mid-March. Every senior coordinator at Glenridge now had a living document, updated quarterly, that captured not just their procedures, but the institutional knowledge underneath the procedures, the carrier contacts who responded better to calls than emails, the clients whose tolerance for delays varied depending on which product line was affected, the unwritten agreements that had accumulated over years of relationship building and that would otherwise disappear the moment a person left. Ethan had built the template himself, field by field, based on everything he wished had existed at Brighton and didn't. Su-Yan had been the first to complete hers, thoroughly and without complaint, and had sent it back with a note. This would have saved me 4 months on the Meridian situation. Why hasn't everyone been doing this forever? He'd thought about that question more than she probably intended. The answer, as best he could reconstruct it, was that documentation like this required companies to confront the fact that their institutional knowledge lived in people rather than systems. And confronting that meant confronting how replaceable or irreplaceable those people actually were, which was a conversation most management structures preferred to avoid until forced into it by circumstance. Brighton had been forced into it by his departure. He'd rather Glenridge reach that understanding voluntarily, in advance, before the cost of not having it showed up somewhere expensive. Daniel had approved the framework in one meeting. No committees, no 6-week review cycle, just read it, asked 3 specific questions, said implement it, and moved on. Ethan had noticed this pattern across his first months at Glen Ridge. Decisions that at Brighton would have entered a queue and emerged weeks later in diluted form were made here with a directness that still occasionally caught him off guard. Not recklessness, just the confidence of a person who trusted his own judgment enough to exercise it, and trusted his team enough to tell him when he was wrong. It was, Ethan recognized, the thing Marcus Whitmore had never quite managed. Not because Marcus was incapable of it, but because somewhere in his formation as a leader, he'd learned to confuse deliberation with control, and the two things were not the same. Frank Deller called in April. Ethan was at his desk when the call came in, and he almost didn't recognize the number before he answered. Clearwater Distribution's main line, which he hadn't seen on his phone in months. "Frank," he said, when Frank identified himself. "Ethan." Frank's voice had its characteristic mild precision. The voice of a man who communicated exactly what he intended and nothing extra. "I heard you landed at Glen Ridge." "About 3 months ago now," Ethan said. "I should have reached out sooner." A brief pause. "I want to say directly, the situation at Brighton in December was poorly handled. I don't know all the details, but I know enough. You were a good contact, and they didn't treat that with the weight it deserved." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Frank Deller saying something like that required a certain kind of professional generosity, the willingness to name something plainly that most people in his position would leave tactfully unsaid. "I appreciate that, Frank," Ethan said. "Genuinely." "Clearwater has finalized our Q2 carrier arrangements," Frank said, shifting with characteristic efficiency back to business. "But Q3 is an open question. We're looking at our regional logistics partnerships. I'd like to have a conversation about what Glen Ridge can offer." Ethan sat with that for a second. "I'd like that too," he said. "Good." A pause. "I'll say one more personal thing, and then we can be professionals about this. I mentioned your name to someone at a conference about 18 months ago, Daniel Cho." "He told me," Ethan said. "He's a good operator," Frank said. "You two will do well together." They scheduled a call for the following week. Ethan hung up and sat at his desk and looked at the carrier documentation board. The color-coded system he'd rebuilt from memory, refined and improved, made more transferable than it had ever been at Brighton, and thought about the specific chain of events that had led to this call. Frank mentioning his name to Daniel at a Baltimore conference. Daniel filing that away and reaching out the moment he heard Ethan had left Brighton. The conversation at the coffee shop on Carlisle Street. The offer letter signed with his father's pen. He thought about how different things might have looked if Marcus had simply said yes in December. 2 days. His mother's wrist. If the answer had been yes, Ethan would have gone to Roanoke and come back and kept going, kept absorbing, kept building the quiet resentment of a person who knows they're undervalued, but has convinced themselves that knowing it is the same as addressing it. He might have stayed another year, maybe 2, until something else happened, something worse probably, because these things tend to escalate when the underlying dynamic doesn't change. The no had been a gift, in that brutal way that the worst moments sometimes are. Not a comfortable gift, not one he'd have chosen, but real. He drove to Roanoke in April to see his mother, the first visit since Christmas. She met him at the door without the splint. The wrist had healed well, the surgeon satisfied, the physical therapist dismissed with faint approval. And she looked, he thought, exactly herself, which was the best thing she could look. She made dinner. He was not allowed to help. He sat at the kitchen table of the house he'd grown up in and watched her move around the kitchen with the efficient, slightly impatient energy of a woman who considered other people cooking in her kitchen an act of charitable interference. And he thought about all the times he'd called her from his car in the Brighton parking lot, between the office and the drive home, burning 10 minutes of the commute. Just talking to her because the transition between the two spaces required something that phone calls to his mother somehow provided. He hadn't needed to do that as much lately. He still called her, often, but not as a decompression mechanism, just because he wanted to talk to her. She put a plate in front of him and sat across the table, and they ate and talked about the neighborhood, about the neighbor whose quick 911 call she now regarded with grudging warmth, about the oak tree in the backyard that needed trimming, about a book she'd been reading and thought he should read. She asked about work in the precise way she always asked about work, not the generic "how's the job going" that didn't want a real answer, but specific questions that indicated she had been paying attention to previous conversations and filing information for later use. The Clearwater account, she said. The one you told me about, Frank Deller. He called last week, Ethan said. We're having a conversation about Q3. She nodded. Good. It's not finalized, he said. I know. But the fact that he called means something. She set down her fork. It means the reputation you built there is yours. Not Brighton's. Yours. He looked at her across the table. The kitchen light was the same light it had always been, warm and slightly yellow. The overhead fixture unchanged since he was in high school, and his mother was the same person she'd always been, watchful and direct and fiercely unwilling to let the people she loved misunderstand their own worth. I'm starting to understand that, he said. You understood it when you signed the offer, she said. You're just catching up to understanding that you understood it. He smiled at that. She picked up her fork again with the satisfaction of someone who has said the precise thing. After dinner, they sat in the living room and she told him, without much preamble, that she'd been thinking about the fall. Not about the injury, about the fall itself, the moment before the neighbor called, the 40 minutes she'd been on the bathroom floor before help arrived. It wasn't pleasant, she said, which was her version of saying it had been frightening, in the understated vocabulary of a woman who had spent a lifetime considering fear an insufficient reason to stop doing things. I kept thinking about whether you knew that I was proud of you. Ethan looked at her. Mom. I know you know, she said, which cut off whatever he was going to say. I'm not asking for a conversation about it. I'm just telling you that it was the thing I thought about, not the wrist, not whether someone would find me, whether you knew. She adjusted her hands in her lap. You should know the things people think about when it gets quiet enough. He didn't try to make it into a moment. She wouldn't have wanted that. He just said, I know, and meant it, and she nodded once and said, good, and turned on the television, and that was that. But it settled in him somewhere permanent, the way a few things do, not loudly, not dramatically, just with the quiet weight of something true that had been said plainly between two people who loved each other without much ceremony. He drove back to the city on Sunday. The highway was different in April than it had been in December. Same road, same geography, but the trees had the first green on them now, that uncertain early green that looks provisional, like it's still deciding whether spring is really happening. He had the windows cracked for the first time since fall. The air smelled like something moving. He thought about the things his mother thought about on the bathroom floor, and about what he would think about if it ever got that quiet for him. And he found, not without some surprise, that the answers were different from what they might have been 6 months ago. He would think about Nora's kids on the beach in the photograph, the one now sitting on his desk at Glenridge instead of tacked to a wall in a corner office he no longer occupied. He would think about whether the people he'd worked alongside knew he'd actually seen them. Not as positions, not as resources, but as the particular human beings they were, carrying their particular knowledge and history and imperfection into a building every morning because they needed to, and because some part of them still believed it was worth something. He thought about the whiteboard, whether it was still there or whether someone had finally erased it, whether the third floor had found its way back to something that functioned without him or was still absorbing the slow accumulation of gaps his absence had left. He hoped it had. He genuinely did. Not for Marcus's sake and not for Brighton's P&L, but for Diane, who brought banana bread on the first Friday and kept doing it even when the floor was having a hard month. For Phil, who had stood in front of the whiteboard with a dry erase marker and correctly understood that overwriting something you didn't fully understand was worse than leaving it alone. For the people on the third floor who showed up every day and did the work and deserved to do it somewhere that understood what they were actually contributing. Loyalty is not a personality trait. His mother had almost said that in the kitchen in December, and he'd arrived at it himself somewhere on the highway between Staunton and Lexington. You don't owe a place your willingness to disappear into it. What you owe, what good work actually requires, is your honest effort, your genuine knowledge, your real presence. And those things are only sustainable when they're given somewhere that treats them as what they are, valuable, finite, and belonging to a person who also has a life outside the building. That distinction had cost him a long time to learn. He didn't entirely regret the time it had taken, because the learning that costs you something tends to be the kind that holds. But he thought about the people still working through it, the ones who hadn't hit their breaking point yet, who were still absorbing, still covering the gap, still confusing endurance with loyalty. And he hoped for them the way you hope for someone making a mistake. You recognize because you made it yourself, with the specific compassion of personal experience, and without the condescension of thinking you would have known better sooner if you'd been in their position. You don't know. You never know until you do. He merged onto the final stretch of interstate, the city skyline coming into view ahead of him in the April afternoon, real and gray and complicated. The same city it always was, full of the usual ongoing dramas of people trying to figure out what mattered and what didn't and who they were when nobody was requiring them to be something specific. He felt, driving toward it, the particular quality of a person returning to a place that had started to actually belong to them. Not perfect, not resolved in all its parts, but his. He turned the radio up and drove the rest of the way home with the windows down and the April air coming through, carrying whatever April carried. The smell of something that had been cold for a long time,